talks to ordinary people about their extraordinary experiences with ghosts, spirits, and fairies. So, ladies and gentlemen, a very, very warm welcome to Neil Geddes-Ward.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to get a warm welcome in Glastonbury. It's a place I'm very, very familiar with. I tend to try and come here at least once a year, so I'm sure a lot of you do too. So hopefully you'll have a really enjoyable weekend. So thanks for the lovely welcome. Now, I've got a lot to get through here, so I'll just give a brief introduction to myself. I did obviously have an introduction there from Sheila, but I'll kind of give a bit of background about myself. I'm born one of 5 boys. I'm in the middle. We're all artistic. I'm the only one that's kind of pursued the artistic side of myself. But we all have that artistic talent within us, which we got from my father. I'm also the only person ever to get a full refund from odor eaters, but that's another story. There will be further corny jokes as we go through this, so take it as you will. But anyway, as mentioned there in the introduction, we spoke about fairycraft, and fairycraft is the melding of kind of Wicca and magic and working with fairies. And I was predominantly the illustrator on that book, and I've illustrated other books as well, as I said, being an artist. But in our research for that book, we came across different types of fairies. There seems to be 4 different sorts of fairies that most people identify throughout history, based upon their accounts. There's the elemental ones, and if you think the typical Tinkerbell sort of fairies that Disney puts out there with the wings, and they represent the fairies of the air, and obviously the Disney-esque version of it, and the Victorians have glamorized it with small human figures with wings and things like that. But they're predominantly associated with the elements of the air, but I'm not necessarily saying that they would always be seen with wings, and I sometimes think that's more of an artistic license. But that's not to say you'll never see a fairy without wings, because they may kind of meld with our mind a little bit and work with our own ideas of what we think they are. Then there's the elementals of fire, and that's not one that commonly people know about. That tends to be associations with the elements of fire, but also people have seen fairies associated with electricity as well. I remember someone telling me once they saw fairies near a pylon, of all places, an electricity pylon. So that'd be a good tariff to have, I'd imagine, if you're changing companies. Then there's the water fairies. Now, maybe some of you have seen a few films where these have been featured. I remember the film Fairy Tale a number of years ago, where they feature water sprites and that. And they're associated like sylphs of the water or mermaids even. Someone even suggested many, many years ago that, even the Loch Ness Monster, if it actually exists, could be a fairy of that kind of thing. But I'm not suggesting you're likely to see a great big Nessie coming into land with wings on Loch Ness, but keep an open mind, as they say. And last but not least, there is the fairies of the earth, or the gnomes, and they're typically associated with old mines. Cornwall's a place that you should visit if you want to try and get legends about the gnomes of the earth in tin mines and things like that, and stories of miners going down the mines and seeing little sprites and creatures that either show them the way or maybe lose them the way. So again, we're going to talk about fairies. They're not all the twee kind of creatures that one would suppose. There's some that maybe you don't really want to come to terms with or even cross, which I'll cover. Now, during our research for the Fairycraft book, we looked around at various books, but also looked at various films. And there's a film out there on DVD. I think you can probably still get it on Amazon. And it's called The Fairy Faith. And it's by a Canadian filmmaker called John Walker. And he basically went around the world and interviewed various people who claimed to have seen or worked with fairies at some level. And I think he went, obviously, to his homeland in Canada. He went to Canada, Scotland, Ireland, a few other places in Europe, maybe, to actually interview these people. And I seem to remember he interviewed a lady here who used to probably reside in Glastonbury a few years ago. They played a harp, but I can't remember her name now. But there was a very interesting story he told about a guy that had gone on holiday from Scotland, and he had gone to Southern Ireland, and he was a Glaswegian builder by trade. So he's a very kind of down-to-earth, practical guy. But he said he was sitting there, and it just finished raining whilst he was on holiday, whilst he was trekking around Southern Ireland. And the clouds were parting, and a rainbow was forming over the valley as the sun was coming out. And he could hear this very strange music coming from somewhere, but he couldn't pinpoint where it was actually coming from. So he decided just to sit there and watch the scene unfold before his eyes. He was absolutely mesmerized by the landscape, the beauty of the landscape and the sun and the rainbow. And all the time, he was looking up at the sky. In his peripheral vision, there was something moving down by his feet. And he wondered what on earth it was. But he thought, no, I'm going to carry on looking at this scene unfolding before me. But all the time there was this strange thing round by his feet. So he decided, well, I'm going to have to see what it is because it's really bugging me. And he looked down by his feet. And there, he said, by his foot was this small being about that big. And it appeared to be female. She had brown, leathery-looking skin. And he said, like a small kind of hat on her. And he said she appeared to be cutting round the sole of his shoe with what appeared to be old-style sheep shearers. Big old pair of scissor type things. And he thought, what? And he said, where his shadow extended at the end of the sun, the afternoon sun, where his shadow extended outwards, he said there was the male equivalent of this being, and this is where it gets freaky, so strap in. Basically, he said that this male being, like the husband, if you like, was rolling up his shadow like paper. Yeah, exactly. Totally freaky. You're thinking, what on earth has he been drinking, this guy? But this is what he maintained was happening. You couldn't have made it up. And he said he didn't know what to think. And so he said, oi, he shouted as he looked at them, because he didn't know what to say to them. He just shouted, oi. And they looked at each other, he said, as if they were surprised that, my God, he can see us. And he said they went, phew, and just vanished. And he said, I dread to think what would happen to me had I had not seen them. Now, it's an interesting thought because you think, why on earth are they cutting away a shadow? How can they actually cut away a shadow, which kind of defies physics anyway? And also, these things shouldn't really exist. So there's three wacky things going on there anyway. And then you start to think about maybe Peter Pan with his shadow, and you're thinking maybe J.M. Barrie had a few ideas about kind of shadows and interactions and things like that that we don't know about. So there's a whole host of things you could start to delve into by listening to that guy's story. And as I said, that's the sort of thing you wouldn't really want to make up. I mean, it's quite brave of him to tell us that story. So it gives us an interaction of what's possibly sometimes happening. And why would they be taking his shadow? Are they taking away part of his soul, perhaps, or a part of his energy? Are they kind of like vampires? And do vampires have an association with fairies, the legends of taking blood and things? Maybe there's connections, you see. Now, also, this filmmaker went back to Canada, as I say, and he went to visit a lake in Canada where this lady had an experience back in 1974 with her children. She had taken 3 of her children, I believe, on a little picnic by the lake, and they had a strange experience there. Now, similar to the guy that had been in Ireland, they heard some strange ethereal music coming from somewhere. They couldn't pinpoint where it's coming from. It's like a strange singing. And what they did in the film, they'd gone back to this lake with the mother and the daughter that was with them at the time. And this girl was obviously grown up now. And they were remembering how it all unfolded. And the mother said, I'd got the children, and they were in the lake, and they were paddling about, and was having a nice time. Then we heard this strange music, and I thought, I don't like the feeling of that. I feel I've got to get out of here. So she decided that she wants to put the kids in the car straight away and leave. And of course, the children are happily paddling, and she's saying, come on, get in the car, get in the car. And she's trying to urge them to get in the car, and the kids are going, why? And she goes, get in the car. So they got in the car, and the daughter then said, I remember that. I remember being hustled into the car by my mother, and I remember my mum starting the engine and saying, don't look out the window, don't look out the window. But she said, as a child, I just had to look out the window. And she said she peered out the back window, and as the car drove away, she saw these small beings dancing, she said, hand in hand, coming down the pathway to where they were. There must have been about 10 of them or something like that, all arm in arm, and they were singing this strange song. And they were kind of running towards the car, but luckily the car sped away. And that's all they saw of them. They didn't come to have any harm, but the mother had a natural urge to get away from them, you see. So there's legends and stories that if you get enchanted by fairies, you can end up missing time. There's old stories where people fall asleep and wake up 10 years later and some of their relatives have died or something, or they've missed whole chunks of their life out. And so they say, don't get enchanted by the fairy music and don't eat the fairy food. That's an old legend as well, because they put you under their spell. And some people even suggested that ETs are masquerading as fairies. Again, that's something else you may want to research if you want to go that way. But a few interesting kind of scary stories. As I said, they're not all twee little fairies that are going to grant you wishes. You have to kind of respect their fairy world. And like people, there's probably good and bad and in between, okay? Now, I was on a plane a number of years ago, flying to Spain. And at the time, I ran this fairy museum in the UK. It was the only fairy museum, we believe, in existence in the UK anyway. And because I'm an artist, I had lots of my fairy artwork up there. And this was in the Orkney Islands in Scotland. So I was on this plane going to Spain, and my son was sitting in the seat next to me looking out the window. He was about 4 years old at the time. And the last chap to get on the plane sat next to me, and I thought he was Spanish because he had kind of dark skin and perhaps he's heading back to Spain. But anyway, we got chatting, and it turned out, he said, I'm from Iran. He said, I prefer to call it Persia because that's its original name, but you would know it today as Iran. So, he was going out to Spain. I learned that to be, because he was an architect, he was going out to Spain to check on some of the projects he had been working on. And he said, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm an artist. I've got this fairy museum. And I started to show him a few pictures on my camera of the work that I'd been doing, of artwork. And I told him exactly the story I told you earlier about where this fairy had been cut in the shadow around this man's feet, you see. And I thought, well, okay, I'm now stuck in this strange world and I'm discussing strange things with a complete stranger. Let's see where we go with it. And he said, I'll tell you a story. And he opened up a bit, you see. And he probably wouldn't have told me this had we not gotten to strange things. And he said, many years ago, when I was in Persia, I was conscripted into the army. I was about in my early 20s, and I was patrolling the streets at night with an army buddy. And we were going around the streets, and a sandstorm kicked up. And he said, typically, sandstorms are very common in that area, so everyone tries to seek shelter. So they found a shelter in the form of a mosque. So they went into this mosque, took their shoes off, which is customary in mosques, and went in. And it was completely, probably low light, something like this. And he said to his army friend, look, you go to sleep for an hour against the wall. I'll sit upright against this wall. I've got the gun. I'll keep a lookout for any trouble. So, okay, that's what they did. So his friend went to sleep, and I'll call him Hussein because he didn't want his real name revealed, which was Saddam. Okay. I told you they get worse as we go on. But anyway, Hussein sat against the wall with his gun, and he couldn't help it. He was nodding off. It was getting very late. He kept nodding off, and he said, oh, my God, I must keep awake. I must keep awake. He said he nodded off the third time, and by the third time he woke up, he went, oh, I must stay awake. But on the third time he woke up, he noticed there was a lady crouched down by his feet, looking intently down at his feet. And next to the lady was a girl, probably about 12 years old, he said, looking at his buddy's feet. And he thought, where did they come from? I don't remember hearing anything. And they're not even looking at me, but they're looking at the feet. What's going on here? So he said he tried to wake up his friend by pressing his elbow on his chest. And he said no matter how hard he pressed, his friend wasn't waking up. So Hussein said, I decided to get the strap of the gun and wrap it slowly and carefully around my wrist so that when I ran away, the gun wouldn't swing. And I thought, but you're the fellow with the gun. It didn't make sense, but there we go. So as he was doing this, he said that the lady looked up from the feet and then looked at him, and he said she looked me straight in the eyes. And he said as soon as I looked at her in the eyes, I just knew, something clicked with inside, I knew that she wasn't from this world. And he said at that point, the lady stood up and the young girl stood up with her, and they turned and they walked away. And he said, and as they walked away, he noticed they had cloven-hooved feet. Yep. And they walked away and just went into the wall, vanished into the wall. And when he told me that, a shiver went down my spine, as presumably it's done the same to you guys. And I started to think about it afterwards, and I thought, that's interesting. They were very curious about their feet, the human feet. Like, it was an oddity to them that they were staring at the human feet, and they had cloven-hooved feet. So from their point of view, the human feet were the really weird features. And then they went off to wherever they'd come from. And it's interesting, they were in a mosque, which is kind of a spiritual place, lots of prayer, lots of maybe psychic activity. Maybe that opens up portals or something, connections with the other worlds. And then again, you step a bit further thinking, hang on, haven't we got legends of Pan and cloven-hooved creatures in our past? Made up stories, but perhaps there's some real truth to these legends in some way, which we've forgotten. And occasionally we get glimpses, as Hussein probably did, of this other world in that special place. So I said, do you mind if I write this story down? He said, yeah, but just, I'll keep out of it because I'm an architect now, so just give me a false name or something like that. And we separated and never saw each other again. So it's an interesting story. And it's interesting that, this is an ordinary guy. Again, he's not into anything alternative. He was just an ordinary guy, young guy at the time, had this very, very strange experience, you see. So anyway, I'll leave that scary story with you, and I'm sure you'll sleep at night. Now, where do we get to? Oh, yeah. So we'll move on slightly from fairies, and we'll go slightly into the ghosty spiritual world. I'm sure there's some people that are going to put their hands up. Who's seen a ghost? Yeah, okay, that's very good. And who's seen a spirit then? Oh, now people are not quite sure. Okay, I'll tell you what I think ghosts are, and I'll tell you what I think spirits are. Okay, so if you think you've seen a ghost, but you might decide later you've seen a spirit, depending on what I got to say. Okay, my interpretation of ghosts is that there could be things like recordings on the atmosphere, and certainly psychically charged situations or sensitive people might pick up on them. So, for instance, in the same way that you can record a TV program and you can watch it back and see the news from yesterday or something, I think that we can certainly view history of the past being replayed in the present sometimes. And when people see ghosts, sometimes when the ghost is not interacting with them, it's not looking at them, it seems to be doing something and it seems to be oblivious to the person viewing it, that possibly could be some sort of psychic remote viewing from our present to the distant past. There's an example there. As I mentioned, I lived in Orkney, and I knew a couple that lived in one of the oldest houses in Orkney, and the husband told me he often saw down his hallway a ghost of a monk, he said, sitting down on a stool, and he appeared to be chatting to someone, and he could see the effect of a flames on his face where maybe he was sitting by a fireside that wasn't actually physically there in his time, but he could definitely see the flickering light on his face, and he appeared to be having a conversation, but he couldn't hear the sound of it. And it was a very silent ghost from his perspective. And he'd often see this. And so he thought that his house might have had something to do with a monastery many years earlier. So I would regard that as perhaps he was somehow seeing an impression from the past. But it's also interesting, someone raised the point a number of years ago to me that they said that ghosts have a kind of a shelf life, if you like, that after maybe 200 years, the audio of a ghost or the sound of a ghost doesn't get heard anymore, which is interesting. I've never actually seen that myself or got any proof of that, but I thought it was an interesting point. So even they have yellow stickers these days, so they don't last too long. That perhaps explains why we don't see ghosts of dinosaurs, but maybe their shelf life has gone completely out the spectrum. It could be the energy of these things fade away after some time, you see. I don't know. So that was that one. Now, there's also what I call spirits, which I think is more interactive, and they will probably try and communicate with you as much as them, and they may be aware of you, and you are aware of them to a certain extent. And typically, people in psychic circles, I've been in psychic developing circles, the idea is that you learn to tune in to the spirit world and try and open your chakras up and tune in and try and interact either mentally or psychically in some way to pick up impressions from the spirit world. And people that have gone on before us, i.e. they've died, try and come back and send you mental impressions. They tend to communicate mentally, but now and again you will hear their voices as well. Now, many, many years ago, I was doing tarot card readings, and normally people would come to my house and I'd do a tarot card reading for them. Now, one day we had a phone call from this little old lady, and she said, "Oh, I see you do tarot card readings, but I don't drive. Can you come to me?" So I went, "Oh, okay." So I drove to her house. It wasn't too far away, and went to her house. She lived in a small little bungalow, and she lived there by herself, and I did this little tarot card reading for her, and she said, "Thank you very much, that was very accurate, but there's one thing you haven't told me." And I said, "Well, what's that?" And she said, "Well, you never mentioned my husband." And I said, I've got to be honest with you. I said, if I felt your husband around, I would have mentioned him, but I said, I haven't felt your husband around to sort of even warrant a mention. And she said, "Well, it's interesting you say that." She goes, "Let me show you this." And she showed me the bedroom. She said, "In here, my husband spent the last year of his life, and he was so ill that he had to be on a small oxygen machine to help him breathe." And she said that one day, well, every day she would do this, but one day she was lifting him forward, puffing up his pillows for him, and all he could say is, "I feel so ill, I feel so ill." And he says, "I feel so ill, I want to die." And she said with that, he absolutely collapsed in her arms and literally died in her arms. And so she laid him back down onto the pillows, she said. And then she observed this strange vaporous mist, she described it as, coming out of his chest. And it went up towards the ceiling and went right over into the corner of the airing cupboard in the bedroom. And she said, "Whoa, what's going on there?" And she said she told her doctor this, and her doctor just laughed at her. She said, "But I know you won't laugh." But the story doesn't end there, because she said 6 months later, and this is why she was asking if I picked up her husband, 6 months later, out of that airing cupboard, about 3 a.m. roughly in the morning, she saw, and it was her words, a red Indian coming out of her cupboard. And she said he had a full headdress, war paint on his face, he had a bone necklace. She could only see him from the chest up, and he appeared to be doing that, coming out of the cupboard, clawing his way out of the cupboard. but she could only see him from the waist up. But she saw a man behind him who was in the shadows. And behind that man, she said she thought she saw a third person who appeared to be wearing a hat, but she couldn't see him as clearly as the first two. But she was very clear that she could see this native, what I would call a Native American Indian, but she called him a Red Indian because that was a generation of the type of people that she came from. And it just wasn't once. She said this was happening every night, this Native American Indian coming out of her cupboard. And she said, I told my doctor that as well, and he just thought I was stupid, but I know that you won't laugh at me. I said, have you ever heard of spirit guides? And she goes, no. I said, okay. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of spirit guides, so yeah, maybe a lot of you. But for those that don't, they're supposedly advanced beings that have gone on after this life, and they've advanced in the next life to the point where they can come back and help us, or even those on the other side, because they're like teachers, if you like. They've got an advanced level of understanding of the nature of reality. And so I said to her, I think that your husband probably wasn't into this sort of stuff, was he? And she said, no. And I said, I think that's part of the key. I said that your husband, I believe, was that vaporous mist coming out of his chest at the point that he passed away. And I said, I think your doorway, i.e. your airing cupboard, is possibly a portal which is acting as like a revolving hotel door, if you like, to this world, but also they can come back through it, you see. And I want you to remember doorways whilst we're here, so we're talking about doorways. So they're using this doorway to come back into this world. And I said, your husband's limited ability, perhaps, is stopping him from coming back by himself. So I believe this spirit guide is acting as his bus driver, if you like, and he's bringing him back with him. And I think that's the gentleman that's behind this Native American spirit guide. But who the third person is, I can't say. Maybe he's a grandfather or something like that. And she says, well, what do I do about it? And I said, well, you could try asking him questions. The next time you see it, what do you want? And see if they interact with you. But I said, maybe the best people you can speak to at that time, this is about 1995, I think it was, is the College of Psychic Studies in London or the Association the Spiritualist Association of Great Britain, both in London. And I said, call 192, because this is pre-internet days for most people. Call 192, and I'll put in contact and tell them what you've told me and take it from there. I never heard back from her, so I don't know what happened at the end of it. But I think this lady was very, very naturally psychic, and her whole place was psychically charged. The fact she had this portal in her doorway. So I remember getting in my car after that and thinking, oh my God, I'm not going to look in my mirror as I drive home by myself. And I'll be talking about mirrors in a minute, actually. Now, there's someone that I knew went away on holiday to Cornwall a number of years ago with her husband. And as I mentioned, Cornwall is a place for the gnomes and things in tin mines, but it also seems to be a very haunted place, being a quite historical old place. And they stayed in this bed and breakfast, a very old cottage there. And they were in the bedroom, and they could hear lots of activity downstairs, lights flickering and things like that, and noises, and they thought, let's go and investigate. So the husband went downstairs, I believe, to the living room, and the wife, Deborah, went downstairs to the kitchen because she also wanted to get a drink of water. And she said as she went downstairs to get a drink of water, there was this girl in the kitchen who was about 8 years old. And she said that this girl appeared to have light coming out of her head, and it was blue, and it was glowing, like shafts of light coming from the back of her head. And Deborah said to her, what do you want? And this girl just kept saying, I want chocolate, I want chocolate. And that's all this girl kept saying. And she goes, where are you from? And all this girl could say was, I want chocolate. Now, I don't remember her saying that she faded away or anything like that. I just remember her describing it, and she managed to run back upstairs or something. By this time, Adam, her husband, had come back from the living room, and he reported that he saw 3, I would call them soldiers, and if you think of that program Sharp, the period of time that he was situated in as a kind of soldier from that period of time, 1800s or something, 1700s, something like that. They were soldiers of that kind of description. And he said he saw 3 of them in the living room, and they appeared to be playing the electricity because they were fascinated with it, somehow switching the lights on and off, perhaps with their mind. But he got the mental impression they died out in the moors of hypothermia. So they were attracted to this house for some reason. Now, it's quite possible the girl who was the ghost in the kitchen, I want chocolate, wasn't aware of the ghosts in the living room, you see. So they're all kind of haunting this place, but totally unaware of each other. Now, they decided on a vote that they were going to leave the place the next day. And he said, this house is as haunted as beep, because he was from Scotland and he didn't mince his words. So they decided to check out of the bed and breakfast the next day. And Deborah said that she saw on the mantelpiece of the living room a photograph of the house as it was maybe 100 plus years ago. And it was a sweet shop. And so this girl, I Want Chocolate, she thought was possibly associated with this sweet shop many years ago. And somehow she thought that the light coming out of her head was an injury perhaps caused by her death. She got the impression she had fallen down cellar stairs or something and hurt her head and obviously died, but this was the injury that was still there in a kind of psychic way, and the light was emanating from it. So there we go. Don't eat too much chocolate. It's bad for you. Now, I mentioned earlier that we had the Indian coming out the cupboard. Now, in seances, which I've mentioned before, mediums tend to use these things called seance cabinets. And they tend to be, in the old days, they used to be sort of like curtains draped around a pole arrangement. But in the more modern times, I've noticed mediums tend to use these cabinets, and they tend to be toilet tents, the sort of thing you might see on a camping site. And it's made of canvas, and it's about, this big sort of thing. And they sit inside it. And I said to this medium, why do you use this? And he said, well, it builds up the energy inside. And a typical scenario would be that in what they call a manifestation of spirit, a spirit can manifest inside of this cabinet because it's contained within the border, if you like, of this material canvas. And the energy builds up. And the idea is that a solid form of a spirit can then step out of it. They call it materialization, can step out of this cabinet or this toilet tent and present themselves to the audience. It tends to be done in infrared light because this kind of manifestation is supposedly sensitive to normal daylight, so everyone has to take off their watches, lights and things like that, and they can only witness this stuff in infrared light. It's a bit like film. Once you open it to daylight, it gets fogged, and so in film laboratories, they'd always develop film with an infrared light as well. So it seems to be sensitive to daylight. So I kind of listened to stories over the years where many people said they've seen ghosts and spirits, and they always seem to be coming out of doorways. I saw my dad, and he was standing in the doorway. I saw that ghost there by the window, or the Indian that came out the cupboard. And I thought, why are all these things always coming out of doorways? And I remember seeing this documentary many years ago where this, it was a haunted house in Scotland, in fact. This guy was typing away on his computer, and he felt that there was a spirit watching him, and he said it was from this doorway right behind me. And they brought in this psychic research team. They had all these electronic gadgets that go around measuring electromagnetic frequencies and all sorts of strange things that go on. And they said, yeah, there's a lot of electromagnetic energy around this house, but particularly around this doorway. And that got me thinking. I thought, that's really strange. A lot of energy around this doorway, and mediums are using these cabinets as their manifestation things. And then we've got portals, i.e. airing cupboards or whatever, opening up where these things are coming through them. So there seems to be a way or an association with doorways or containers where these spirits use it to manifest in some way or be seen. And the best way I can give an analogy of it, if you think of the old style TV, before we had these great big 50-inch plasma things that we all got on our walls now, we used to have TVs that used to stretch to the back. And the idea was it'd fire a photon or something from the tube, and it hit the screen, it'd flash across the screen 50 times a second, and then go back to the top and do it again. But your eye doesn't sort of register it moving along. It does it so quickly. And it builds up a picture. So I think as an analogy that what they could be doing to a certain extent is building up a picture or a form using this framework of a doorway or a cabinet, that the energy bounces around, builds up an image or builds up a form of the spirit. But if you open this doorway up or remove it, it can't bounce around and build up. And the same analogy I would also say, think of a cake in an oven, and it's a liquid form at the moment in a tin, but as soon as you shut the oven door and the temperature's at the right temperature for a certain amount of time, that temperature will change, the heat will stay in there and change the form of that cake into a solid piece of cake or whatever it is, bread or whatever. And so I believe that if you open the oven door, it doesn't work. So you have to shut the oven door and contain that energy. And I believe it's the same sort of thing with manifestations. That is only my theory. I'm not saying it's proof. I've never proved it. It was just an idea. And I remember saying to various psychic investigators, please check doorways and see what you come up with. Now, we've all lost someone dear to us, and I'm sure that maybe some of you had your own encounters, and I'll just share a few of mine with my mum, who passed the spirit world last year, in fact, just over a year ago. It was a very, very sudden, unexpected death, and it was only in hindsight that my brother and I, because he's fairly psychic as well, we talked about it, and we kind of got clues that it was going to happen, but we didn't realize they were clues at the time. And this might also happen in your own lives. You might get clues. The spirit world, I'm told, try and impress upon us when someone's about to pass. It doesn't always happen, or it's not so always clear to us, but sometimes you can read the signs in hindsight. And my brother said for 3 weeks before my mum passed suddenly that he could smell the tobacco smoke of our granddad, my mum's father, and he smoked a particular type of roll-up cigarette. And he thought, that's Grandad Bob's cigarette. Why am I smelling that? And on the night of my mum's passing, I was actually at the house because I was doing some video editing on an Apple Mac that we had at the house there. And I watched a bit of TV with him, and I carried on upstairs. And then my dad said that my mum's going to go to bed now, but he's going to go to bed with her because she doesn't feel well. So she clambered up the stairs really slowly, and I sort of said, I hope you feel better in the morning, night. But as I said it, something felt wrong. It didn't feel quite right within me to say that. I hope you feel better in the morning. It didn't quite click, as if I was telling a lie, but I wasn't quite sure why I felt strange about it. And it was only, of course, during the night that she actually died. And in hindsight, I think maybe I had an inkling of something that was going to happen, but I didn't realize at the time. So my brother said also, about a week before she died, he used to sleep at the house, and he said he was in his bedroom at the time, and he saw my mum come through his bedroom door, come through the bedroom, and she looked about 40 years younger than she was. She was 78 when she passed, and she only looked about 35 or 40, as he saw in this vision. And he said that she was holding what appeared to be a dress out, and she skipped through the bedroom. He said it was like a silent movie. There was no sound whatsoever, and she was smiling as she skipped through. And she just passed straight through the window on the second floor of the house. So he was getting signs, we were all getting signs, and then she passed to spirit. But that wasn't the last of her, because we've heard from her since. She always rings up after 6 because it's cheaper. But yeah, I know that people have this thing about Ouija boards, and don't touch them, don't touch them. But we were given this very, very surprise noticed reading a few weeks ago, my partner and I, with this couple who call themselves Heavenly Voices. They're based in Dorset. We just happened to be in the place at the right time. Suddenly they get a phone call saying they've got a cancellation. Are we interested in going tonight? So we said, okay, let's go. So we took our recorders along to record the thing so we'd remember everything that was said. And they said their prayers and things like that. They got this little portable Ouija board set up with legs and things, and the glass started to move. And even before, these people didn't have time to research us or anything like that. They didn't even know our names when we got in the room. So people say, they get it off Facebook and things like that. There's just no way that they could research that information because we were spontaneously asking the questions off the top of our head. And how would they know the answers to it? So we asked things like, what's my middle name? And she spelt it, Alexander. What's the name of my dad? Brian, with a Y. And she came through, even before she said who she was, she said the first letter of her name, it went to M. And I thought, I know who that is. And she said, hi, son. She was really excited to come through, hi, son. And then they said, who are you? And it said, Margaret. So we asked her a whole load of testing questions, even things about a flower that my partner had bought her maybe 2 years ago, because my partner bought her one of these little solar flowers from a shop where they have a little solar battery thing on it, and when the sunlight comes out, these plastic petals wave, and she bought it as kind of a fun joke. Well, my dad said to me about 3 weeks before this reading, he goes, can you replace this solar flower, because it's broken? I said, okay. He says, I really like it, but your mum hated it. That was his words. Your mum hated it. I said, why did she hate it? She goes, the tick, tick, tick of the flowers used to annoy her. She's trying to have her afternoon nap, you see. So I said, okay. So we tried to buy a new replacement flower for him. So I told my partner this, and we had a bit of a laugh about it, that she hated it. So during the reading, my partner said, Margaret, what did you think of that solar flower that we bought you? And it said, I liked it. And she said, are you sure now? And then she came through the exact words, I hated it, exactly as my dad had said 3 weeks earlier. So we thought, oh my God, that's quite amazing. But that's just a small sample of the things she said. She said so many things that were totally accurate. And it was like I was with her. It's like she was texting me from the spirit world. I was getting it in her vocabulary, the way she would have said things, either by text or vocally. And there's a 2-year waiting list to see these people in Dorset, Heavenly Voices. So check them out on Facebook if you want to read them, but you've got a bit of a wait, unless you maybe put yourself down for a cancellation or something. Right, okay, let me go. Oh, yeah. Now, a number of years ago, I used to work in a broadcasting place. Now, this is where I move away slightly from the normal dead people. I go into very strange, unexplained dead people or strange things that we just don't quite know what they are. I worked with this guy called Owen. He was a security guard, and I worked in this broadcasting company. And at the time, I overheard a conversation he was having with someone, and he was saying, "She was white as that fridge freezer." And I thought, oh, this sounds ghostly, I better listen in. So I said, what were you talking about? And he said, this woman I saw. I said, what woman? He says, she was sitting on a church roof. I went, what? A woman sitting on a church roof? He goes, yeah. Now, this guy, he said, well, he comes from the West Indies, and he named a particular island he lived in, but I can't remember what it was called now. But he said that him and his friend were coming back from this pub late at night or something, after the bar had shut. They're walking their normal route home, and they pass the church every night. And there's the graves, and as they come around the corner, there's the church on the hill. But on this particular occasion, as they came round, there's the church on the hill, and there was this woman, as white as a fridge freezer, sitting on top of the church roof. And I laughed. I said, well, what's a woman sitting on the church roof for? He said, she was no ordinary woman. She was at least 50 foot tall. I went, what? So the way I envisaged it, as if, like this was a doll's house, and you're sitting on the church roof like that, legs either stride of it, 50-foot woman. I thought, no wonder they're always trying to raise money for the church roofs, all these 50-foot giants sitting on them. But yeah, that's what he said. But the funny thing about this guy, he said, I don't believe in ghosts or ghoulies or things that go bump in the night, but he saw this. And now people say, oh, hallucinations. He saw it as a hallucination. So I said, well, what did you do? He said, well, he said to his friend, who by this time was carrying behind a gravestone, hiding from it, he said, do you see this as well then? It's not just me. He goes, yeah, I see it. So Owen, being the braver of the two, he said he picked up a stone and he threw it as hard as he could at this 50-foot woman. Not a really good idea, but there you go. He threw it at this 50-foot woman. She got slightly peed off because she stood up and stepped over the church and started to walk towards them. That's not the best thing to do, as I say, throwing stones at 50-foot giants. But she walked towards him, and I said, what happened next? He said, well, she started to shrink in size and became the size of a normal person, and then just dissipated into the ground. And then we never saw her. Just went on our way home, and that was it. I thought, crikey. But still he maintained there's no things of ghosties, ghoulies, and things that go bump in the night. There's nothing of the sort, he'd say. And I thought, he's in some sort of denial mode about this. Anyway, eventually he moved to England, and he said that he married an English woman. He said, but one night he was driving down the road, and as he was driving, he looked in his rearview mirror, and he looked again. He thought, oh, my God, there's a woman sitting in the back of my car. He looked, there was no woman, but then he could see her still sitting in the back of the car. And he, without realizing, he put his foot on the accelerator and panicked a little bit as he drove along. And, of course, the police saw him. They pulled him over, and they said, do you realize you're doing 70 miles an hour in a 30-mile zone? And he says, yeah, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry, officer, but I've just seen this woman in the rear of my car, sitting in the back there. And he said, when I said that to him, the officer completely changed his stance. He went, that's all right, you can go now, sir. And he said the way he said it is as if this spirit woman or something had been seen in the back of other people's cars on that stretch of road. So we wondered if maybe she had died in a road accident there or something like that, and a ghost was still haunting the premises. But yeah, very interesting story. Because ghosts also make themselves known in mirrors as well. That's a kind of thing that's come up in other things. There was a guy that I met a number of years ago who did a talk for a group that I run in High Wycombe. And he worked for the RAC, but in his evening time when he had free time, he would do ghost hunting. So he kind of had an understanding of this sort of thing. But it was his job to go and collect ambulances as part of his job. When ambulances broke down, the RAC had a contract with the NHS, and they'd go and collect their ambulances. And they weren't legal to drive, but he had to obviously drive it back to the depot to get it fixed. So this happened. He got in this ambulance, strapped himself in, adjusted the mirror, and as he adjusted the mirror, he saw a woman sitting in the back of the ambulance. And he went, oh, my God. Now, this was a ghost hunter, but it still freaked him out. So he got on the phone to his girlfriend. He says, you're never going to believe what I'm seeing here. I'm seeing a ghost in the rear of the mirror. There's a woman sitting in the back of the ambulance. And so his girlfriend said, but talk to her. And he goes, no. He said, if you were here sitting next to me to reassure me, then we'd maybe communicate with her. But I'm by myself. I don't want to do it. So he had to turn the mirror that way so he couldn't see her and then drive it to the depot. Now, it's an interesting point. Most people think that ghosts haunt graveyards and things, but I actually think they're probably likely spirits to maybe haunt, and I don't really like the word haunt, but we use it, haunt the places they were maybe dying or passing over at. So there seems to be lots of spirits being in ambulances because it's the place where they passed over dead on arrival. And there's an interesting case. I mentioned a story that I heard at a campfire thing about 4 years ago. A friend of mine was celebrating her 50th birthday, and they said, Neil, tell us some of your ghost stories around the campfire. So I just proceeded to tell them a few stories to get them to sleep at night, and as you do. And so this girl, I'd never met her before, she goes, well, I don't really talk about this thing, but as you're talking about it, I'll talk about this one. She goes, I work in a hospital, and the way she said it, I thought she worked at Southampton Hospital, but she said, I know this story to be true because I know the doctors. I know the 3 doctors that I work with, and they're as straight as a die, she said. She said that what happened was, at this hospital, they've got the seriously ill patients that are wired up to heart machines and everything. They're literally at the brink of death, and they're being monitored on the 4th floor of this hospital. And on the floor above them are all the doctors and the medics and the nurses and things like that, and they all have these pagers. And when one of these people beep, flat lines, they get a pager, rush down, and they have to kind of resuscitate him or something. So, of course, it happened. Their pagers went off. 3 of them rushed down the stairs. It was quicker than taking the lift. As they're rushing down the stairs, they passed a girl sitting on the stairs in her bedgown, a patient. And they said, what are you doing here, sitting on the stairs? And this girl kept saying, my stomach hurts, my stomach hurts. And that's all she kept saying. They said, well, you should be in bed. And all she kept saying, I can't, my stomach hurts. So they said, okay, look, stay here. We've got to go and sort someone out. We'll send someone up to help you, okay? Don't go away. They rushed down to the 4th floor, went to the room where this person had crashed, and there on the table was the same girl they'd seen on the stairs, dead on the table. And so I believe that this girl had died, and somehow she had floated out of her body and then ended up in the stairwell of this hospital. Now, people say, but why was her stomach hurting? Surely she should be at peace as she's died. Well, the fact that the 3 doctors saw her suggests to me that she was still resonating to a certain frequency of our earth. So she could be seen a little bit by certain maybe doctors or psychic people. Maybe those 3 doctors were psychic or something, but they saw her sitting on the stairs. They even interacted with her. And I believe that what happens, I mean, people talk about the solar cord that connects our body to the earth body, if you like, and they say that at death this cord breaks or something. So the legends say anyway. Maybe, and I'm not saying it's the truth, but maybe this cord had snapped and she felt the pain of it in her mind because she was still associated with the earth plane, so therefore she was still feeling pain of the earth. Of course, when they went back there, she was gone. But I thought it was an interesting story that even medical doctors are now starting to see them. And I've actually also heard stories where nurses in training, and I can't say this is across the board of the NHS, but in certain hospitals maybe, nurses in training are now being told if they go home after a shift and they feel the spirit of one of their patients that's died maybe that week or that day around them, that they have to go straight back to the hospital and have it dealt with. I don't know how they deal with it, but that's what they're now being told, that if they feel the spirit around them of a patient. So it's becoming commonplace now that nurses are bonding with patients and their spirit lingers because they don't know what's happened and they're following someone home that they feel that might help them. And of course the nurse can sometimes sense them in some way. So I thought that's an interesting thing to relate as well. Now, I mentioned hospitals as well. I did have an interesting story related to me last October by a lady who was at a talk like this, and afterwards she came up to me when I was talking about hospital situations and spirits, and she said that, unfortunately, a number of years ago, she had to go to hospital and a baby died giving birth, and so she was obviously in a great trauma thing about it, and so they put her in this room with the dead baby in a cot, and she was just sat there by herself, and she sat on the bed and she thought, how can I be strong? How can I be really strong for my family and my husband? I just don't know how I can be strong, and I've lost my child there. And she said within a few minutes, into the room where she was came 3, 4, maybe 5, she wasn't sure the exact number, small centaur beings. So we're talking about people that have got like horsey feet, if you like, but human bodies. And they came in, and 2 of them were looking at the dead baby in the cot, and 2 of them were looking at her face. They didn't say anything. She said they looked as ugly as anything. They weren't pretty or beautiful. They weren't romantically nice looking. They looked pretty ugly, but they just came into the room. And I said, well, how long were they there for? And she said, I don't know. I lost track of time. But these 3 or 4 centers, maybe 5, I didn't count, came in and were just staring at me. And somehow afterwards, I felt the strength in me to kind of get through this all. And maybe it was something to do with that strange visitation. So again, what were they? Fairies, ghosts, spirits, something else. Legends that we can't actually pin down. But this is, I'm saying, we're getting into the very sort of strange stuff here. How am I doing for time, by the way? Am I still good? 15 minutes, thank you very much. Okay. So yeah, I mentioned medical things again. There's actually a doctor now that I know called Dr. Ian Rubenstein. Now he's a regular GP. He works in Middlesex, I think it is. He actually works in Enfield in Middlesex. That's the place of the Enfield poltergeist, for people that have heard of that story. So he knows a few people that are involved in that case from the 70s, the Enfield poltergeist. But he found that he was having psychic experience as well, even before he trained as a GP. One of the things he did see with his sister that witnessed it as well was this girl that he had the hots for in his teen years. They're all around someone's house on an afternoon, and he was stringing this girl along a bit, he said. You know, he's playing with her heartstrings a bit. And this girl suddenly just stopped what she's doing, went blank, and he said he saw this face appear over this young girl, and it turned into what he described as the Ice Queen type of face, even frosted blue lips, he said, and she had piercing blue eyes. And his sister saw it as well from the side, and she went, oh! And so he looked at his sister and said, can you see this? And she goes, yeah. And this voice spoke through this face that was materialized over. I've heard it's since called Transfiguration, where they transform the face somehow of the person. And it basically said, stop messing with this girl. Stop messing with her emotions or something, or grow up towards that effect. Stop playing with her emotions. And then she just went back to normal. And he said it was the most drop-jawing experience he's seen in all his years. And that was like when he was 18 or 19. And he since went on to become a trained medical GP. But unfortunately, the psychic things carried on. So he would be in his surgery, and psychic things would start to happen. And he said that one time this woman came in severely depressed, and she was really down in the dumps and things like that. And he said he felt the presence of a man over her shoulder, and he felt that it was a man in a uniform. And he said, I feel there's a man in a uniform around you, and I feel it's your father. And basically, to cut a long story short, this spirit somehow communicated with him, and it turned out her father had been killed in an IRA situation many years ago, maybe in the early 80s. He had been killed by the IRA, and she had never really got over it, as you can probably understand that. And this is why she was so depressed. So he related back to her that the father is saying that he's fine, he's okay, and, you know, to carry on with your life sort of thing. So he then started to write out a prescription for her, and she goes, I don't need it. I don't need it now. I'm happy. And she went away out of the surgery elated that somehow her spirits had been lifted by this visitation from her father in her own GP surgery. And you don't get that on the NHS normally, do you, really? I mean, there's a long waiting queue these days, so that's going to make it even a longer waiting queue. But apparently, he said, this is getting bandied about at his surgery now, and then people go in to see him about their bad knees or bad shoulders or whatever it may be. And anyway, this lady came out one day, and she said to the receptionist, well, I've been to see Dr. Ian Rubenstein. And they said, well, yeah, I've got a complaint. And they go, what's that? He said, well, he's seen me about my bad knee. Yeah. But he didn't give me a psychic reading. So he's been bullied now into doing psychic readings for his patients and things. But anyway, if you're interested in the work of Ian Rubenstein, check him out on the internet. Just type in Dr. Ian Rubenstein, and I'm sure he'll come up on Google. He's got a website, and he's even got a book, okay? So if you want to look into him a little bit more. I've had transfiguration experiences many years ago. I wasn't aware of them then. I was younger, but I was experimenting with channeling, or trance, as some people call it, or channeling, whichever way you want to look at it. And I was trying to get hold of this spirit guy called Henry, I was told I got, who I was told was a Victorian gentleman, and he was a writer, and that he worked with me in some way. So I was told that this face appeared over me, and sideboards could be seen on my face, and as my own lips spoke, the lips of this spirit face synchronized with mine and spoke as I spoke in trance for him. And yeah, it was quite an amazing experience, but unfortunately I couldn't see it, but I was told it was seen on my face when I did that. So I've had a little bit, but unfortunately I couldn't see it myself. Now, I've got a friend called Juliet, who my partner knows very well, and she's allowed me to tell you this story concerning her. It's a personal story, so I said, can I tell this to the people here today? And she goes, yeah, that's fine. Just give me 50 quid or something. So basically, Juliet had a very tragic past to a certain extent. which was forewarned by spirits. Spirits from the afterlife came and warned her of a situation, which is a very interesting thing, because normally people see spirits and they vanish, but these ones came with a warning. Basically, she woke up in her bedroom, and she saw the spirit of her grandmother at the end of the bed, and she also saw another lady who she recognized as someone that she used to practice haircutting on, like a client many, many years ago. These two never knew each other in life, but there they were at the end of the bed, and the grandmother said, "Juliet, get out of this house, get out of this house." And she went, and she tried to touch them, and she said they shimmered away, and she tried to touch them, but they wouldn't come back, and that was it. They just said, "Get out of the house." She was living in Germany at the time, and her husband was in, I think, the first Gulf War. So they were stationed out in Germany, and she was living in a forces accommodation, and she was there living with her 2 young children, and these spirits were saying, "Get out of the house, get out of the house." Anyway, 10 weeks passed, her husband returned from the Gulf War. They had a few marriage issues and things like that, so things weren't going brilliantly for them, and occasionally they would stay at the house, and sometimes they would go and stay at the dad's house. And the dad had obviously some sort of trauma from the Gulf War, and they went round to see him at the house one day, and the little child said, "Mummy, why is Daddy hanging from a tree in the garden?" And unfortunately, the trauma was so much for him that he took his own life by hanging himself in the garden. And the police later came, the MOD police, and they found in the cellar lots of nooses that this husband had made, one to kill the dog with and a couple to, unfortunately, kill the children with. And he had basically was going to take the entire family out apart from Juliet because it was just so bad. And you can see now why the mother had come back and said, "Juliet, get out of the house." They knew something was going to happen like that, of that sort of magnitude. And anyway, Juliet was like a week later laying in the bed with her children, 2 young children, and she said her own husband appeared in the bed next to her, and he just sat up and looked at her, and she described his face as having his lip up like that, it's kinked up, just like that, in his face as he looked at her. And she, go away, and she waved him away, and he vanished. And then when she went to the funeral, a few days later, it was an open-top coffin. She happened to notice his body in the thing, and the same lip was up like that in the coffin, like that, of his physical body. So that had reproduced itself in the spirit body of the husband. So he actually returned for whatever reason, either to say sorry or he was just hanging, still materializing to let himself be known in some way. I don't know. But it was a story that I was allowed to tell. It had sad overtones, but I thought it was an important thing that it had warnings from the spirit world, so they do try and help us in some way. Right, where do I go from here? Now, there's a lot of people say, "Oh, mediums are fake, it's all rubbish, they're not in touch with the spirit world, blah, blah, blah." And I've had my own strange, I've had good readings, I've had bad readings and things like that. And I've seen some really bad examples of mediumship, particularly with physical mediumship, where all sorts of weird things are happening, where they've got a trance cabinet and you hear strange voices coming out, and the voices sound very much like the Tweenies, or we had one example where this voice medium was coming out with all sorts of characters from the spirit world, and one of the characters he was bringing about, celebrities, he said, "I've got Louis Armstrong here," and he started to sing Louis Armstrong voices, singing badly in tune and out of time with his own record. And then he said, "Oh, I've got Crispin Quentin here. Crispin Quentin, hello, it's Crispin Quentin." And everyone in the room went, "Crispin Quentin? Doesn't he mean Quentin Crisp?" So I thought even he couldn't get his name right, you see. And that's just a real bad example. And unfortunately, with this kind of thing, you do get the bad and the good and the bloody brilliant. It just depends on the luck of the draw and how long you've been doing it. I've got about 5 minutes, have I? Okay. 6 minutes. All right, I will cut a lot of that out because I can go on and on and on. But I'll just close with this very interesting story. Someone said to me, "Do ghosts come in all shapes and sizes?" And I thought, well, I've never been asked that question before. And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, many, many years ago, I was working in this MOD contracted establishment, probably in the late 60s, early 70s. It was a big, big mansion building. And he said, we were doing the precursor to what you would call the silicon chip. We were trying to develop something like that back then. And he was an apprentice electronics wizard at the time. He was working on one side of the room with his bits and pieces, and his friend was working on the other side of the room. And then suddenly the whole room filled with blue light. And they both thought, what's that? And they both turned round, looked at each other, and they saw this blue box floating literally down the middle of the room, about the size of a shoebox, and it was glowing blue. And they thought, what on earth is that? This blue box floated out of the room, turned right down the corridor. It must have had indicators. Yeah. Mirror signal maneuver, checked and went out, went down the corridor, and they tried to follow it and had gone. And they thought, my God, what was that? So they went and told their boss, we've just seen this blue, strange box floating down the room. And he said, come with me, come with me. So he took him down into the basement, and there was this old boy that had been there a long, long time. And he said, tell him what you've just seen. I said, well, I've seen this blue box floating down the hallway, and it just freaks us out. And this old boy said, yeah, I've seen it too. He just said, I've seen it too. And they wondered what it was. They didn't know what it was. And so that's why he said to me, do ghosts come in all shapes and sizes? He thought it was a ghost. And I said, well, it doesn't sound like a ghost that I would know of. But I said, the fact that you're researching strange technology, if you like, futuristic technology, that it's all kept secret, it's MOD, hush-hush stuff. I said, I've heard stories that aliens, ET, whatever you want to call it, can infiltrate these places. And it's my guess that maybe that is their technology coming in to see what you guys are up to, and they send in some kind of remote device that films you or something, records what's happening, watches what you're doing, and just spies on you. I don't think it's likely to be Russians or Japanese or Chinese. I don't think they've got that sort of technology. But this thing was floating down the corridor. And this was about 1970-ish, something like that. So it's long before we've had anything that flies in the skies that we've got today. So I thought I'll leave with that strange one. So I've talked about ghosts of the past, ghosts of the present, and I can guarantee one thing, that will all be ghosts of the future. Okay. So with that, I'll say thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.